All right, welcome in everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I'll let Autumn kick it off for us here.
Thanks, Carrie. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us as we continue our webinar series featuring our ADI hacks for investigations in the hybrid and virtual classroom. Today's webinar is ADI hack number 4, types of investigations. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as well as our social media platforms for later viewing or sharing. If you haven't already, please follow us on Twitter. You can see that in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen and to interact with ADI and our community. My name is Autumn Lenartz. I'm the Assistant Program Coordinator here at ADI. I'll be in the chat and monitoring the Q&A, so if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to post them. Facilitating our webinar today is Carrie Burt, our PL Specialist. We're going to go ahead and review how you can interact with us throughout the webinar. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon where you can submit your questions. And your question could be selected to be answered live at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. If this is the case, your question will be marked answered live. We'll also be taking additional questions in a little bit more of an informal setting after we end the session. The chat function allows you to chat with each other throughout the webinar as well. As always, we'll be sharing a lot of ideas really quickly, but don't worry, this webinar will be recorded and posted to the website as well as emailed to webinar registrants. Any links that we share during the webinar are available on the webinar notes page, which you can find at this link, and I'll go ahead and post that, or Carrie just went ahead and posted that in the chat. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Carrie.
Thank you. I did realize it didn't go in as a live link, so I'm fixing that real fast. There we go. Now it's a link. So welcome in everyone. So glad you are here and able to join us this afternoon. Wanted to go through over some goals that we have for this webinar. I wanted to give you a couple of different frameworks that you can use to think about ADI investigations, and then also some options for supporting those different kinds of investigations in hybrid and face-to-face settings. And then we'll also do a live Q&A session at the end where you can have any of your questions answered. So the first thing I want to jump in on is ways that you can think about ADI investigations. There's lots of ways that you can sort all of the labs we have. We're up to, I think, 9 or 10 books now, and they're all full of investigations. We have the ADI online platform that has even more. Some of those are brand new investigations. And with all of those, one of the ways that we tend to sort them is into investigations that are more introductory in nature and investigations that are intended more to be an application of content. So an introductory ADI is going to fit really well at the beginning of your lesson cycle. That would be the way that students learn about this topic, figure something out about this topic. Application ADIs are intended more for synthesis. Couple of tips and tricks here. If you are doing an introductory or an application, you really need to consider how much information they need before they start. So how much what concepts do they need to be successful, and then what concepts should you not cover before they get going so that they still have something left to figure out. The second kind of investigation model, framework, whatever you want to think of it as, is sorting based on the experimental design. So that might be, this is a model we used when I was a teacher in Texas all the time. Some investigations are going to be more descriptive, some are comparative, some experimental, and some other types. And this isn't necessarily based on the complexity of the investigation. You can have extremely complex descriptive investigations and extremely simple experimental design, or, flip it the other way. But having it sorted this way, make sure that if you can do a little bit of this throughout the year, that gives students a broad understanding of what science can be. Descriptive investigations are things where they're just going in and seeing how something works or gathering information about a place, like what is our weather like here from that elementary investigation. In physics, they've got a really complex one that's how does gel electrophoresis work? Comparative is going to be where they're sorting between maybe two competing explanations for a phenomenon, or coming up with a comparison of different types of objects or different life cycles in this case. Experimental design is the one that we always think of when we think of labs. That's going to be something with variable testing. And then we also have some other types of investigations that involve things like model testing or model based inquiry. And then also some that are design challenges that are sort of engineering based and ask the students to refine a design over time. With all of these, you want to make sure that you are matching the proposal, especially that the students are doing, to the lab that you're asking them to do. So if it is a descriptive investigation, making sure you're not asking them to come up with variables in the beginning because that's not relevant. If it's a experimental design, having them really think through as many possible hypotheses as they can so that they are making predictions in their data for what that's going to look like if it supports the hypothesis, that sort of thing. The other types of investigations are really going to be uh, very different from a traditional ADI, and we'll get into that a little more in just a minute. The third way you can sort these is based on the type of data collection. And this is what we're really going to dig in on today. We get asked all the time, teachers will ask us, I'm just getting started with ADI and I'm not sure what should be my first investigation experience with my students. And this is the model that we would recommend presenting to a teacher who's asking you that or thinking through it this way yourself. So simpler investigation types are going to be ones where they are figuring out an unknown based on their experiences with some known qualities or doing a simulation, a card sort, things that are fairly straightforward. More complex investigation types include ones where they're going to have to collect a little bit of data every day over a long period of time, or the data analysis investigations where they're having to go into a spreadsheet or a website and the design challenges and modeling, just because they are fairly different from the work that the students would do in the other kind of ADIs. So, what I'm hoping to do with this webinar is dive in on each of these types, give you a description, an example investigation, and then go over some tips and tricks for implementing that type of data collection in a face to face or virtual environment. We'll start out with the identify the unknown. This is going to be the kind of investigation like students do in the physical properties of matter investigation from our physical science book. In this investigation, students are given a lot of different metals and acrylic and glass, and they're asked to measure the physical properties of those. And then you take all of those up and give them a couple of unknown materials, and they have to use what they learned about the knowns to identify the unknowns. This comes up in quite a few investigations in the physics books. There's an elementary version of this, a similar lab to this that uses chemical properties, where they have to identify an unknown powder based on how it reacts with iodine and vinegar and water. This shows up in some of our life science investigations. For instance, the cell organelle investigation that we have, where students are given pictures of different kinds of cells and then asked to identify an unknown cell based on what they see. Some tips for this are to just think about material management. Sometimes on these investigations, every group is going to need a full set of all of the stuff. And sometimes you'll be able to have a class set and they can just take what they need and put it back. So, for instance, in that cell one that I just described, you can just have one pile of plant cell slides and one pile of animal cell slides, and they can take what they need and put it back. In other investigations, it's going to be important that they have their own set. So in that elementary powder lab, they're going to each need their own amount of each of the powders. Another thing to consider with these is to decide whether students are going to be able to look back at those knowns once they've moved on to the unknown stage. Autumn, will you repost that notes page just one more time? I want to make sure that everybody has that. You can use that notes page. It's got all this information, so you don't have to do a million screenshots or write things down. If you're doing this virtually, then you're going to want to think about how the kids are going to access those knowns and unknowns. So maybe you mix the vinegar and the different powders together and you video that, and that's how they access the materials. Maybe it's simple enough that they have physical things they can do at home. Taking pictures of before and after can be a way to do it. Just giving them raw data. The physical properties one can be you can do that with data if you need to, or describing it. And the other thing that you would need to consider, just along with that second bullet point on the left, is ways to take away the knowns if that's important to you. A lot of times teachers in a face-to-face classroom like to take away the known samples so that students are having to really rely on the data that they collected. If you're doing this digitally, that may be a little more difficult. It's not necessary, but definitely something to think about. As we go through this, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat or use that Q&A button, and we may be able to answer them as we go, and we may save those for the end. The next investigation type is simulations. Students are going to use a simulation to collect data in place of some kind of hands-on material. This allows us to do a lot of things that you wouldn't physically be able to do in a classroom. Um, and some things where it's just easier to do it this way, or maybe you need to because your students are learning from home, so you've made a trade a simulation for some hands-on things. There are tons of these throughout all of our investigations, and some tips for this are that you really need to know how the simulation works and then show the students that as part of your tool talk. The next step after that is in the tool talk. Before they're ever asked to use the simulation to do anything, kids need some time to just play around in there, click all the buttons, drag things around, see what they need and all of that. Another thing to consider if you're doing this face to face is whether every kid in the group is going to have their own computer, or only one student is going to have it. So um, it it's up to you. I found that sometimes if you have every student in the group with their own computer, they don't work together as well to collect the data. It becomes sort of an every person for themselves data collection experience. But certainly, if you've got a group of four, trying to get all of them to gather around that one computer may be difficult. So just something to think about. And the last thing with simulations is making sure before the kids get going that the simulation will actually pull on their device with their login. Um, you just want to log in. There are some simulations that need certain types of computers, and sometimes firewalls will block things. So just log in as them and make sure. If you're doing these virtually, it's a good idea to record whatever tool talk you do and post it to your learning management system, your Google Classroom or your Canvas, whatever it is, so that you kids can look back over it. In a face-to-face classroom, if they're stuck on something, you can walk around and help, but in a virtual environment, that's not always the case. Another thing that you can do is use breakout rooms if that's a possibility for you to get them to collect the data. If that's not a possibility for you, they could work together to make some procedures using a collaborative Google Doc or something like that, and then each collect their own data and come back to the group and share out and compile that data. That can be a good way to do it. If your students are learning at home, I recommend sticking mostly with HTML5 investigations just because it's guaranteed to pull on whatever device. They don't all have computers at home necessarily. So if they're trying to pull it up on a cell phone or a iPod or whatever, that can make sure that they're going to be able to open it. The third type of investigation that you see in a lot of our labs is card sort investigations. So these look very different depending on what they are, but the basic idea is that they're using some information on a card to try to figure out what the answer is to their guiding question to make a claim. So, one example of this is the food web investigation, where the students are given a series of cards with different organisms on them, plants and animals, and they have to use those cards to create a food web and then decide what happens if an organism is taken out of that food web. For the tool talk on this one, my biggest learning with these investigations was to not hand them every single card during the tool talk, because what happens is they'll start actually trying to answer the guiding question. So give them a couple of the cards so that they can see the kinds of information that are on there, but you don't have to hand them all out at once. Um, and again, just like with the identify the unknown, sometimes every group is going to need their own set of cards, and sometimes you can get away with doing a class set. So just kind of think that through before you get going so that you get the right amount of materials. If you're doing this virtually, there are some great collaborative boarding tools out there. You can use Jamboard's a great way to do it. If you don't have access to Jamboard for your students, you could just use a Google slide. That works as well. If you are not a Google district, you can do this with Padlet or Lucid Chart. And there's another one that's called Miro that used to be called Web Whiteboard that is very similar to a Jamboard. It's just, a big collaborative space where students can work. So you can recreate the cards in that program, and then the students can still manipulate them and move them around and interact with them. Main tip if you're doing that though is just make sure you maintain copyright. So if you're copying cards, whether they're from us or somebody else, just make sure you're within your rights on the copyright and kind of think that through. Last kind of these simple investigations is going to be the short term hands on investigations. And there's obviously a broad range of hands on investigations, some of which are much more complicated than others. But on the whole, if the kids are able to collect all their data in one day or one class period, that's going to be your lowest hanging fruit for investigation. So this picture on the right is actually out of my classroom. You can see this was the soil texture and soil water permeability investigation, and the students put different types of soil into these little funnels and ran water through that soil in a coffee filter to see how permeable, what rate the water made it through the soil. Um, this still requires a lot of a tool talk. If you are if you are doing this face to face, please make sure you try it yourself. Actually set up all of the materials, actually collect the data, get an answer that you would get based on it. That's going to do quite a few things for you. It's going to allow you to figure out what the safety concerns are with the investigation. It's going to give you an idea on how long that's going to take, which sometimes, like I always figured out how long it took me and then doubled that amount of time for my students. It's going to give you a chance to think through what kinds of variables students might come up with. They'll always surprise you, right? They come up with just such creative and interesting ways to solve problems, but at least lets you have a running start so that you can think through how you're going to support. And then it also allows you to steer them away from any variables that you're thinking they shouldn't change that don't tie back to whatever the core idea is that you're hoping they get out of the investigation. For example, in the potential energy investigation that we have, the students can change characteristics of a seesaw system to see how they can get an action figure that's resting on one side to go as high in the air as possible if they drop clay on the other side. And there are lots of things that they can change about that system that do increase or do affect the potential energy. They can change the size of the clay ball they're dropping, the height they drop it from. They can change the size and like size or mass of the figurine on the end. What you don't want them changing in that particular investigation is the fulcrum point, or where the middle of the seesaw is. That is a valid thing to change, but does not really tie back to potential energy in the same way that you would want it to. But you're not going to know that kids are going to want to try that until you actually do the investigation yourself. So that's my biggest tip there. The other thing with these is show them how to use the apparatus. In this soil investigation, I set one of these up and showed them. They didn't need to figure out how to get soil to go through without coming out the bottom, right? If you're having students use a crucible in chemistry class, the point of that investigation is not for them to learn how to use a crucible. It's to use a crucible to figure something else out. So don't waste a lot of time with students showing them or making them figure that out. Let their creative process come from what variables they're going to change, the amount of time they're going to allow things to last, how many trials they're doing, that sort of thing, not how they're going to build the apparatus itself. On the virtual side, some ways to sort these if you've got to have kids do this from home. Finding investigations that use simple enough materials that they probably have access to them. Subbing in a computer simulation is always a good idea. And another one that I've heard of lately is having the kids write some procedures and then film yourself collecting data using different kinds of procedures so that they can watch a video of that investigation. Certainly takes some time, but that can work. And along a similar line, you can turn this into a data analysis investigation sometimes and get kids through it that way. All right. On the more complex side, we've got investigations that use hands on materials, but over the course of time. So, one of these is in elementary, there are a couple of investigations that ask them to grow plants. Obviously, that's not going to happen in one class period, right? So that isn't necessarily a complex data collection process, but because it is over the course of many days or weeks, you are going to need to have some slightly different considerations. First is, does every group all day need their own set of materials? Like, do you need, you know, 48 sets of plant seeds, or can you clean up at the end of the class period and then give that same material set to the next group? That it may be a combination, but just thinking through the materials, that's something to think about. Another thing is, in a normal investigation, you're always going to have some students who finish early, right? You're going to have a group that's done 5 or 10 minutes before all the other groups. If you're collecting a lot of data over the course of a week or two, there's a chance that you're going to have groups that are done much, much earlier than other groups. And so you want to make sure that you have a plan for what happens with those students. And another thing to consider with this is to, as part of their proposal, make sure that they are uh, explaining what they're going to do on each of the data collection days. So it's okay for you to say, we're going to collect data once a day, every day. And then, as part of their proposal, have them write out, on day one, we're going to look at this, and day two, we're going to look at this. That can change if they get into it and they're like, oh, actually, that wasn't as relevant as we thought. We're actually going to collect this data. Totally fine. But it helps if they know they've got something they have to do on each of those days. It makes that time more purposeful. If you're doing this virtually, you want to make sure that you've got some real checkpoints built in. I did science fair in the past, and that was always a fun adventure to watch, a handful of students do their lab, their entire science fair project, start to finish, the night before it was due, right? So we want to make sure that we've got some clear uh, deliverables that the students are doing for each of those. Maybe they're turning in their updated data once a day or once a week. Um, this may not be the best investigation type for at home learning, but I think there are some of these that would work really well. Like, kind of cool to watch a plant grow at your house and see how it does, but you just be considerate of whether or not this will work. It's possible that another investigation type or another data collection method may be better. Data analysis investigations, I listed this under more complex just because there's a lot of moving pieces in these. The investigation sample I pulled up is periodic trends in high school chemistry. Um, it this is like a fraction of the spreadsheet that they have available. There's tons of different pieces of information that they get and they have to go through and process. So the first thing I would recommend is to make sure that you really understand what they're supposed to get out of each of the little websites they're going to, or out of each of the data sets that they're going to. Make sure that you've got a good firm hold on that so that you can get that across in your tool talk. Students sometimes, I think, look at these big data sets and then just go, well, that's a lot, and then mentally shut down. So the better you can explain what the point of it is and what they're supposed to be getting, the better. But you do need to find the balance there between over scaffolding and then them not knowing what it is they're supposed to be doing. So it is possible, in an effort to help them not feel confused about the data table or the websites, that you over scaffold and they don't have any choice anymore. Make sure you're finding that balance. I think these data analysis investigations are really easy to do in a virtual space. But again, in a face-to-face classroom, if a kid's confused, then you're able to walk over and be like, oh, well, here's what you're supposed to be doing that with that. In a virtual environment, they don't have access to you in the same way. So make sure you've got lots of support videos or whatever created. Record yourself as you're doing that tool talk, all of that, so they can go back and help themselves a little bit. The other thing is, you want to really look at the investigation proposals for this, and this goes for face to face as well, and make sure that they know what they're supposed to be getting. It doesn't have to be written out in 47 steps or whatever, but just definitely look closely at these investigation proposals and make sure they have at least some grasp on the purpose of the investigation, what they're changing, or I guess what they're analyzing out of that data set. The last group that I wanted to look at, as far as tips and tricks, is design challenges and modeling. So in a design challenge, students are going to create and test a design. There's one in the physics book about wind turbines and maximizing the amount of energy you get out of a wind turbine. This is in like the middle school physical science books as investigations like creating an ice pack using exothermic and endothermic reactions, or there's one about what kind of lens you would need for different types of vision, that sort of thing. So the other one in here, and I'm going to talk about these together because they're a little different, but the modifications are similar, is when students are creating a model that explains some sort of phenomenon and then refining that model. And an example of this is the moon phases investigation. Students spend the first little part figuring out what causes moon phases, and then they use that model they've created in their head to make predictions about what the moon phase would be in a month or in 3 weeks later from what it is right now, that sort of thing. Um, with these, they can be really, really powerful learning experiences, but they definitely take more time. Students need um, more time to develop the model. They probably need a second round of feedback loops. So you want to have one, and it can be in lieu of doing a proposal, right? But they need to have a time where they show the created model or they show their design and get feedback on that. And then they need to test that model or build and test that design and get feedback on the results that they get. So it's really nice if you can build in a second round of whiteboarding and argumentation for this. The whiteboards themselves look a little different. So instead of the claim being a sentence, the claim becomes their model or their design. The evidence becomes why that model is accurate. So what they know based on their tests or how it did in their testing as they were going through. And the justification then is the bigger science concepts that they used that apply, that are relevant and make this the right evidence to show. If you're doing this virtually, just kind of consider based on what students have at home. For design challenges, it's probably a good idea to have every kid build their own version of the model or the design. For model building, it's kind of nice if they're working together on that. But depending on the investigation, it may still be good if every kid has their own version of the materials at home. Um, that kind of helps to keep everyone engaged. All right. So we went through some different ways to think about ADI investigations and then tips and tricks for at home and hybrid investigations based on this model. We're going to move into our live Q&A just one more time. We've got a link here for a notes page that has all that information I just went over. If you would like to look at that, just know that it is case sensitive. So if you have any questions, you'll submit those to our Q&A. You can click that little Q&A button down at the bottom. And while those questions are coming in, I'm going to go through a couple things. Our next webinar is going to be on February 24th. It's over writing assessments and exit tickets. I'm really excited about this one. I feel like people are it, assessment is such a thing that everyone is trying to figure out right now, right? So we've got some great ideas and templates and things that you can use to keep those assessments three-dimensional and in big and small ways. So exit tickets at the end of the day can be a really powerful assessment. We wanted to give you some ideas for ways to align that with the ADI process. Um, just a quick shout out for our ADI online model, takes the investigations that are in the books and puts them into a space where you can do those with students at home or in the classroom. They go through all of the stages in this one platform, so they're not having to jump around from website to website to website. It's all kind of in one place, which we've gotten great feedback about. There is a demo investigation we can enroll you in if you're interested for that. And you can run through an investigation as a student. And if you want to see more information on that, there's a little ADI online drop down on our website, and or you can go to argumentdriveninquiry.com/overview. We do have quite a few asynchronous courses if you're wanting to jump in more introduction courses, as well as some next steps courses for people who've already been through the introduction to dig a little deeper in their understanding. We have 3 synchronous workshops coming up. One is a virtual introduction for secondary. We have an introduction to math in April. And then in May, we're actually going to do a deep dive on writing assessments and give a little more in depth than the webinar will be. And we can also come out to your district, and we've got virtual versions of our workshops we can do now as well. So if you're interested in getting your teachers trained, then we can do that. And the last thing is, if you would like, you can get trained yourself and take the workshop back to your teachers. We've got 2 Train the Trainer Institutes coming up. One is going to be fully virtual this spring, March 2nd to 4th, and one will be face to face in Dallas. We're hoping face to face in Dallas this summer. Both of those are up on our website. It's argumentdriveninquiry.com/events. So if you want to check that out, you can. Yeah, so do this little drop down button, and then there's an events, and you can see all of those options I just went over. We are on Facebook and Twitter if you're interested in joining us. So we're argument driven on Facebook and Twitter, and we'd love for you to come join the conversation. Lots of great people chatting about implementation, sharing resources and ideas, showing pictures of their students' works. It's a great place to be, and we do have other webinars and a ton of videos, just quick videos on different scaffolds and stages. You can see videos of students going through the different stages of the model, that sort of thing on the video part of our website. All right, so let's open it up for our Q&A. Autumn, do we have any questions?
Yeah, well, David asked a really great question about seeing past webinars. So I went ahead and put that link in the chat. All of our past webinars are available on our website. So the link is there in the chat. And then as far as Q&A questions, Carrie, Sarah asked, what do I do if my kids who are learning at home and my kids who are learning in-person learning have to do the same investigation?
Yeah, I've been hearing about that a lot lately. So the kids who are learning at home are some schools, I guess, are getting to have sort of 2 separate curriculums, but a lot of people right now are having a synchronized set of curriculum that they're doing between those kids so that they can come back to school whenever and be doing exactly the same thing. So, if that's the case, one thing I really like is grouping students up with the at-home kids and the at-school kids so that the data collection can happen at school, but the student who's at home can see it live and be in there with some at-school kids. I think that's the best modification I've seen for that. If that's not possible, if it's something where you really want them, then finding a computer simulation that is really analogous to the work that they're doing in the classroom with physical materials is another way to make that work. Um, or having your students who are collecting data record themselves and using that as the data collection that the students at home, they watch the videos of their partners collecting data if the at home kids are asynchronous, that sort of thing.
All right. And then one more, Jeff asked, or Jeff said, it's hard to get kids to collaborate when they won't turn on their camera during the breakout sessions. So how can I make this work?
Yeah, so I was just talking to some teachers about that the other day. They were one of the things we realized was that sometimes getting kids to write can be a really powerful way to have them give feedback without feeling like they're putting themselves out there and letting the whole world see their house. So putting argument boards into like a Google slide deck and having them use the comments to give each other feedback on their arguments can be a powerful way to see at a glance who is participating and also take away the stigma, I guess, of having to have your camera on and say something live. Another option is to use something like a Flipgrid and have the kids record themselves. That gives them a chance to try it multiple times before they submit that recording. And then this other students can comment or do video comments. They can do text or video comments, I guess, to give feedback. So again, they get to practice that and try it. And if they aren't happy with it, delete it and do it again and that sort of thing. So it's a little less pressure than a live conversation over the internet, but still guarantees that you've got some accountability and an idea of who they are. I heard one teacher say that it was, how did she word it? She said they did a Flipgrid argumentation session and there were some students who she'd literally never heard their voice all year this year because they'd been at home. And she was like, they had a great voice, like I was telling them, like, you should talk more. You have such a nice voice. And so I think that's kind of a way to get around that. Any other questions?
It doesn't look like it unless somebody wants to submit something quickly before we finish up.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for attending, and we'll be back in February with ADI hack number 5. So, y'all have a great day.